$400,000. 5 years of preparation. 17 expeditions across 4 continents. 2,300 hours of specialized training. And Oliver Wright died because of a $2 screw. On May 19, 2004, at 600 meters on Mount Everest, the crampon binding on Oliver Wright's left boot released without warning. The screw that held it in place, a tiny piece of metal no larger than a fingernail, had sheared clean through. Oliver slipped 15 meters down an icy traverse, struck a rock outcropping headfirst, and never regained consciousness. He was 48 years old, a husband, a father of 3, and one of the most meticulously prepared climbers ever to attempt the mountain. The official cause of death was recorded as traumatic brain injury sustained in a fall, but that designation misses the point entirely. Oliver Wright didn't die because he fell. He died because a counterfeit screw manufactured in a factory in Shenzhen, China, a screw that cost less than a cup of coffee, had been inserted into equipment that he paid $12,000 to acquire. His wife, Catherine Wright, has spent the last 20 years trying to prove exactly that. The lawsuit she filed against the equipment manufacturer is still active. The evidence she's uncovered has exposed a supply chain scandal that the mountaineering industry has desperately tried to bury. And the truth about what happened to her husband that morning goes far deeper than a simple equipment malfunction. This is the complete story. Every dollar spent, every hour trained, every warning ignored, and every lie told afterward. If you think you've heard this story before, you haven't. Not like this. Not with the documents that have emerged since. Not with the testimony that's finally been made public. By the time we're done, you'll understand why Oliver Wright's death was not an accident. It was a murder, committed by negligence, enabled by greed, and covered up by an industry that values summit statistics over human lives. Oliver Wright was not a reckless climber chasing glory. He was the opposite. He was a man who did everything right. He followed every protocol. He hired the best guides. He purchased the highest-rated equipment. He trained his body and mind for half a decade. He consulted with physicians, meteorologists, and veteran summiteers. He had contingency plans for his contingency plans. And none of it mattered, because somewhere along the supply chain, between the factory floor in China and the retail shelf in London, someone made a decision to substitute genuine hardened steel screws with counterfeit replicas that looked identical but couldn't withstand the stress of high-altitude climbing. That decision killed Oliver Wright, and the investigation that followed revealed he wasn't the only one. Before we examine the lawsuit, the cover-up, and the corporate maneuvering that continues to this day, we need to understand who Oliver Wright was, not just as a climber, but as a human being. Because this story isn't about equipment failure. It's about what happens when we trust systems that have been compromised by people who will never face consequences. If you're the kind of person who watches documentaries like this one to understand how tragedies actually happen, not the sanitized versions but the real ones, then you're in the right place. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told completely. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. We go deeper than anyone else, and this video is going to prove it. Oliver Wright was born in Manchester in 1956. His father, Thomas Wright, was a factory foreman at a textile plant. His mother, Helen, worked as a schoolteacher. The family was solidly working class, and Oliver grew up understanding that success required discipline, sacrifice, and an almost pathological attention to detail. He showed exceptional aptitude for mathematics from an early age. By 16, he'd won a scholarship to study economics at the London School of Economics. By 23, he'd earned a master's degree in financial engineering from Cambridge. By 30, he was managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of pounds for some of the wealthiest families in Britain. But climbing came first. Before the suits in the corner offices and the seven-figure bonuses, there was the rock face behind his grandmother's cottage in the Peak District. Oliver discovered climbing at age 12 during a summer visit, and it became his obsession. He climbed every weekend through secondary school. He climbed during university holidays. He climbed when he should have been studying for exams. By the time he entered the financial industry, he had already summited peaks across Scotland, Wales, and the Alps. Climbing wasn't a hobby for Oliver Wright. It was the organizing principle of his existence. The money he earned as a hedge fund manager was, in his own words, the means to the mountains. His wife, Catherine, understood this from their first date. They met at a charity function in 1989. She was a barrister specializing in corporate litigation. He was a rising star in asset management, and within 10 minutes, he was showing her photographs of climbs rather than discussing work. She told him later that she fell in love with him at that moment. Not because of the mountains, but because of how his face changed when he talked about them. They married in 1991 and had 3 children in rapid succession: Thomas in 1992, Eleanor in 1994, and James in 1996. By all accounts, Oliver was a devoted father who structured his life around being present for his family. He never missed a school play. He coached Thomas's football team. He read bedtime stories every night he was home. But the mountains were always there. They were the subtext of every family vacation, the background of every career decision, the silent partner in his marriage. Catherine accepted this because she understood it was part of who he was. She also believed, and this would become relevant later, that his meticulous nature made him safer than most climbers. She was wrong about that. Not because Oliver wasn't careful, but because careful doesn't protect you from betrayal. Oliver's Everest ambitions began in 1998 when he turned 42. He had already climbed extensively in the Himalayas, Cho Oyu, Ama Dablam, several peaks above 7,000 meters. But Everest represented something different. It was the completion of a lifelong project. It was the summit that would allow him to look back at everything he'd built and say, "That's enough." What distinguished Oliver from other wealthy climbers wasn't just his experience, it was his process. He didn't approach Everest casually. He approached it the way he approached a complex financial instrument, with exhaustive research, stress testing, and multiple layers of risk mitigation. Over the next 5 years, he would spend $400,000 preparing for a single climb. That figure sounds obscene until you understand what it bought him. First, physical conditioning. Oliver hired a team of sports physiologists, nutritionists, and altitude specialists to design a training regimen specifically calibrated for the demands of extreme elevation. He underwent hypoxic tent training 3 nights per week for 2 years. He completed high-altitude acclimatization expeditions to Denali, Aconcagua, and multiple Himalayan peaks. He built a climbing wall in his garden and used it daily. Second, equipment. Oliver purchased the highest-rated gear available from the most reputable manufacturers. He consulted with Himalayan veterans about every piece of kit. He tested everything in conditions as close to Everest as he could simulate. He replaced equipment that showed any sign of wear, even if it was technically still functional. Third, expedition support. Oliver didn't join a commercial expedition. He organized his own, hiring experienced guides, Sherpas, and logistics coordinators. He selected his team members personally, interviewing dozens of candidates before settling on a group he trusted absolutely. He paid above market rates because he believed quality mattered. Fourth, contingency planning. Oliver created detailed protocols for weather delays, equipment failures, medical emergencies, and route changes. He established turnaround times. He briefed his team repeatedly on decision-making criteria. He built in multiple abort scenarios. By the spring of 2004, Oliver Wright was as prepared as any climber had ever been for an Everest summit attempt. The people who knew him, his guides, his teammates, his family, believed he had reduced the risks to the absolute minimum possible. What none of them knew was that the risks had been raised by someone else. A factory worker in China, a procurement officer at a supply company, a quality control manager who looked the other way. Someone in that chain had made a decision that Oliver couldn't prepare for, couldn't anticipate, and couldn't survive. The Crampon that killed him was manufactured by a company called Alpine Technical Systems, a respected name in mountaineering equipment with a 60-year history of quality manufacturing. Oliver had purchased the Crampon specifically because of that reputation. He'd used earlier models from the same company on successful climbs. He trusted the brand, but trust in this case was misplaced. Because Alpine Technical Systems had, 18 months before Oliver's expedition, made a quiet change to their supply chain. They had outsourced the production of certain small components, including binding screws, to a third-party manufacturer in China. The contract specified that these components must meet precise metallurgical standards. The contract did not specify how those standards would be verified. The screws that went into Oliver Wright's crampons looked identical to the genuine article. They weighed the same. They measured the same. But they were made from an inferior steel alloy that couldn't withstand repeated stress cycles at extreme cold. Under laboratory conditions, they performed adequately. Under actual climbing conditions, the vibration, the temperature swings, the loading patterns, they degraded. Oliver had no way of knowing this. The screws passed visual inspection. They came in packaging that bore all the appropriate certification marks. They were sold through authorized retailers. There was no external indication that anything was wrong. But something was wrong. And on the morning of May 19, 2004, that wrongness would manifest in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment. The expedition Oliver assembled for his 2004 summit attempt was impressive by any standard. His climbing leader was Dmitry Volkov, a Russian mountaineer with 5 Everest summits to his credit and a reputation for conservative decision-making. His head Sherpa was Pemba Dorje, a legendary figure who had summited Everest 11 times and held the record for fastest ascent from base camp. His team included 4 other Western climbers, each with extensive high-altitude experience and a support staff of 12 Sherpas. Oliver had selected every member of this team personally. He'd conducted background checks. He'd reviewed their climbing histories. He'd interviewed their references. He'd insisted on multiple training climbs together before the expedition began. What he couldn't check was the microscopic structure of the steel in his equipment. What he couldn't verify was the integrity of a supply chain that stretched across continents. What he couldn't control was a corporate decision made in a boardroom he never entered by people whose names he never knew. If you're following this story closely, and I hope you are because the details matter, you're probably starting to see the pattern. Oliver did everything right. He eliminated every variable he could control, and he was killed by a variable he couldn't even identify. This is why his story matters beyond climbing, because it raises a question that applies to all of us. How do we protect ourselves from systems we can't verify? How do we trust equipment, medications, vehicles, infrastructure, any of the countless manufactured products our lives depend on, when the chain of custody has become so complex that no individual can track it? Oliver Wright's death is not just a mountaineering tragedy. It's a warning about what happens when accountability becomes diffuse enough that it disappears entirely. The spring of 2004 was considered an excellent season for Everest climbing. Weather patterns were favorable. The route conditions were stable. Multiple expeditions were positioned to take advantage of summit windows in mid to late May. Oliver's team had established camps efficiently and on schedule. By May 17th, they were positioned at Camp 4 at 7,950 meters, waiting for their window. The forecast called for a period of relative calm beginning on May 19th and lasting through May 21st. Dmitry Volkov reviewed the data and recommended a summit push beginning at 10 p.m. on May 18th, with a target arrival at the summit around sunrise on May 19th. Oliver agreed with the plan. Everything was in place. The weather looked perfect. The team was strong. He called Catherine from Camp 4 at 6:30 p.m. local time on May 18th, the last time she would ever hear his voice. She described the conversation later in her lawsuit filing. He sounded confident but not overconfident. He told her he loved her and the children. He said he expected to call again from the summit in approximately 12 hours. He said he couldn't wait to come home. Catherine told him to be careful. He laughed and said, "I'm always careful, you know that." He was right. He was always careful. And it wasn't going to save him. If this story is resonating with you, if you want to understand how corporate negligence and supply chain failures can kill people, then you're going to want to see where this goes. We're just getting started. Subscribe now so you don't miss the investigation, the lawsuit revelations, and the industry cover-up that continues to this day. The team departed Camp 4 at 10:15 p.m. on May 18, 2004. Oliver was positioned third in the climbing order, behind Dmitry and Pemba. The sky was clear. The temperature was minus 28 degrees Celsius with light winds. Conditions were nearly ideal. They made good progress through the night, reaching the balcony at 400 meters by 3:30 a.m. A brief rest, hot drinks from thermoses, and equipment checks. Oliver's crampons showed no issues. The bindings were secure, the screws were tight. At least, they appeared to be. The team continued toward the south summit, reaching it at 5:45 a.m. as the first light of dawn illuminated the Tibetan plateau. Oliver later told Dmitri, in what would be one of his final conversations, that the sunrise was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He had no idea he had less than 2 hours to live, and the screw that would kill him was already beginning to fail. Chapter 2. The Man Who Trusted Systems. To understand why Oliver Wright's death was such a devastating failure, not just of equipment, but of faith, you have to understand how he thought about the world. Oliver wasn't a romantic who climbed mountains to touch the sublime. He wasn't an adrenaline junkie chasing the next high. He was an engineer in a climber's body, a man who believed that systems, properly designed and properly implemented, could reduce any risk to acceptable levels. This belief had served him extraordinarily well in his professional life. By 2004, Oliver was managing over £2 billion in assets for his clients. His investment strategy was famous in the industry for its conservatism. He didn't chase returns. He didn't make bets based on intuition. He built portfolios the way he built climbing expeditions, with redundancy, diversification, and obsessive attention to downside protection. His colleagues called him the safety net behind his back. It wasn't entirely a compliment. Some of them thought he was too cautious, too slow to capitalize on opportunities, but Oliver didn't care. He'd seen plenty of high-flying fund managers crash and burn. He'd seen fortunes made in months and lost in days. He believed that sustainable success came from avoiding catastrophic failure, not from pursuing maximum upside. He applied the same philosophy to mountaineering. When Oliver climbed, he calculated. He assessed routes, evaluated conditions, estimated probabilities. He kept detailed logs of every expedition, weather data, physiological metrics, equipment performance, decision points. He reviewed these logs after every climb, looking for patterns, identifying weaknesses, refining his approach. His climbing partners sometimes found this approach exhausting. They wanted to talk about the beauty of the mountains, the feeling of standing on a summit, the camaraderie of shared struggle. Oliver wanted to talk about oxygen consumption rates and boot insulation values and optimal rest-to-climb ratios. But they also trusted him with their lives. Because whatever Oliver lacked in poetry, he made up for in preparation. When you climbed with Oliver Wright, you knew that every possible contingency had been considered, every piece of equipment had been tested, every decision point had been mapped out in advance. Catherine described this quality in her deposition for the lawsuit. Oliver believed that you could make yourself safe through sufficient preparation, quote, she said. He didn't believe in luck. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in process. She paused, according to the transcript, before adding, the hardest part of losing him wasn't just the grief. It was losing that belief. Understanding that sometimes the process fails, no matter what you do. That there are variables you can't control, can't even identify. Oliver's preparation for the 2004 Everest expedition began in earnest in 2001. He created a 5-year plan that specified exactly what he needed to accomplish, physically, technically, logistically, before he would consider himself ready for a summit attempt. Year 1 focused on baseline conditioning. Oliver hired Dr. Michael Horner, a sports physiologist who had worked with Olympic endurance athletes, to design a comprehensive training program. The program included daily cardiovascular work, altitude simulation training, strength conditioning for the specific muscle groups used in high-altitude climbing, and nutrition optimization. Dr. Horner testified during the lawsuit that Oliver was the most disciplined client he had ever worked with. Most people, even elite athletes, need motivation, he said. They need someone pushing them. Oliver pushed himself harder than anyone could push him. He tracked everything. He analyzed the data. He made adjustments based on what he learned. It was almost clinical. By the end of year 1, Oliver's physiological metrics had improved dramatically. His VO2 max had increased by 15%. His lactate threshold had risen. His resting heart rate had dropped to 42 beats per minute. He could function effectively at simulated altitudes that left other test subjects incapacitated. Year 2 focused on equipment acquisition and testing. Oliver spent nearly 8 months researching every piece of gear he would need for the expedition. He consulted with veteran Himalayan climbers. He visited manufacturer facilities. He corresponded with equipment designers. He wanted to understand not just what worked, but why it worked. The crampons he ultimately purchased, the ones that would fail him, came from Alpine Technical Systems, a German company with an impeccable reputation. Oliver had used earlier models from ATS on several expeditions without incident. He trusted the brand because they had earned that trust through consistent performance. He purchased the crampons from an authorized retailer in London in January 2003. The model was the ATS Extreme 9000, top-of-the-line equipment designed specifically for high-altitude climbing. The binding system used a proprietary mechanism that was supposed to provide secure attachment under all conditions. The price was £12,000. Expensive. But Oliver believed you got what you paid for. What he couldn't know was that the screws holding those bindings together were not manufactured by ATS. They were manufactured by a company called Shenzhen Precision Hardware, a Chinese supplier that had won a contract from ATS's component procurement division by offering prices 30% below the competition. The contract between ATS and Shenzhen Precision specified that all components must meet German DIN standards for metallurgical quality. The contract included provisions for quality control inspections. On paper, everything looked proper. In practice, Shenzhen Precision had no intention of meeting those standards. The company's owner, a businessman named Wang Jun, had submitted falsified test certificates with his bid. The factory's actual production processes used inferior steel alloys that cost a fraction of what specification-compliant materials would require. The profit margin on each batch of screws was enormous, as long as no one actually tested them. And no one did. ATS's quality control procedures relied on sampling. They tested a small percentage of incoming components rather than every unit. The samples that Shenzhen Precision submitted for testing were genuine. The screws that went into production were not. This substitution had been going on for 18 months, before Oliver purchased his crampons. Thousands of units had been sold worldwide. The failure rate under normal conditions was low enough that the defect had never been identified. But normal conditions didn't include the extreme stress of high-altitude mountaineering. Under those conditions, the counterfeit screws degraded. The molecular structure of the inferior alloy couldn't withstand the combination of extreme cold, repeated stress cycles, and variable loading patterns. Microfractures formed, propagated, and eventually caused catastrophic failure. One of those screws was in Oliver Wright's left crampon. It had been slowly weakening since he began his expedition. By the morning of May 19th, it was ready to break. None of this was discovered until after Oliver's death. None of it was known to anyone on his expedition. None of it could have been detected by any inspection Oliver performed. The screw looked fine. The crampon functioned normally. Until suddenly, catastrophically, it didn't. This is what makes Oliver's story so disturbing. He didn't make a mistake. He didn't take an unnecessary risk. He didn't ignore warnings. He did everything right, and he died anyway, killed by a chain of decisions made by people he never met, in facilities he never visited, for reasons that had nothing to do with climbing and everything to do with profit. If you're watching this and thinking about all the equipment you trust with your life, your car, your elevator, your medication, this should concern you. Because the same dynamics that killed Oliver Wright exist in every supply chain in the world. Subscribe to this channel, because we expose these stories. We go where others won't. And there's much more to uncover. Year 3 of Oliver's preparation focused on expedition experience. He organized 2 Himalayan climbs to Cho Oyu in 2002 and Amadablam in 2003, specifically to test his systems under high-altitude conditions. Both climbs were successful. Both reinforced his confidence in his approach. On Cho Oyu, Oliver tested his crampon bindings extensively. He subjected them to various conditions: icy slopes, mixed terrain, technical sections. He documented their performance meticulously. He found no issues. The bindings held. The screws remained secure. What he didn't know was that the screws in those crampons were from an earlier batch, manufactured before ATS switched suppliers. The failure-prone screws hadn't been introduced yet. His testing proved nothing about the equipment that would actually kill him. Year 4 focused on team selection and logistics planning. Oliver interviewed over 30 potential guides before selecting Dmitry Volkov. He consulted with multiple Sherpa agencies before engaging Pembedorhe's team. He spent months developing contingency protocols, reviewing weather models, and coordinating with other expeditions that would be on the mountain simultaneously. By late 2003, his plan was complete. Every detail had been considered. Every scenario had been wargamed. Every piece of equipment had been purchased, tested, and approved. Oliver showed the plan to Catherine one evening in December 2003. It was a bound document, over 200 pages long, with appendices covering everything from medical emergency protocols to communication procedures to equipment maintenance schedules. He was proud of it, Catherine testified later. He said it was the most thorough expedition plan ever created for Everest. He said he had reduced the risk to the absolute minimum. He said he was ready. She asked him, she recalled, what would happen if something went wrong that he hadn't anticipated. He smiled and said that was impossible. He had anticipated everything. That confidence, she said, is what killed him. Not the climb, not the mountain. The confidence that a plan could protect you from what you didn't know. Year 5 was execution. Oliver departed for Nepal in April 2004 with his team fully assembled and his plan fully operational. The journey from London to Everest Base Camp took 12 days, including flights to Kathmandu, helicopter transport to Lukla, and trekking through the Khumbu Valley. Oliver documented every stage of the journey. His expedition log from this period runs to nearly 50,000 words. Observations about weather patterns, terrain conditions, team dynamics, equipment performance. He was gathering data even on the approach, refining his understanding of the variables that would affect his climb. He reached base camp on April 28, 2004. The scene that greeted him was chaotic. Dozens of expeditions, hundreds of climbers and support staff, a small city of tents sprawling across the glacier. Oliver had visited base camp before, on his earlier Himalayan expeditions, but the scale of the Everest operation was different. He wrote to Catherine that evening, "It's extraordinary how many people are here, and sobering to realize that not all of them will make it home. But I'm not worried. I've done the work. I know what I'm doing. And I have the best team on the mountain." He was probably right about the team. He was wrong about what that would protect him from. The acclimatization phase proceeded according to plan. Oliver and his team made rotation climbs to Camp 1, then Camp 2, then Camp 3, each time ascending to a higher altitude, spending time to allow their bodies to adjust, then descending to rest. The process took 3 weeks. During this period, Oliver performed multiple equipment checks. He inspected his crampons on at least 4 occasions, according to his expedition log. Each time, he noted that the bindings were secure, the screws were tight, the mechanism was functioning properly. He had no way of seeing the microscopic fractures developing inside the metal. He had no instruments capable of detecting the degradation. He was using his eyes and his hands, the same tools climbers had used for a century, and they told him nothing was wrong. The summit window opened on May 18th. Weather forecasts showed a 3-day period of stable conditions. Dmitri recommended a push for the summit during this window. Oliver agreed. The team ascended to Camp 4 and prepared for their final climb. At 10:15 p.m. on May 18th, they began the ascent that Oliver Wright would never complete. The climb proceeded smoothly for the first 7 hours. The team maintained a steady pace, reaching key waypoints on schedule. Oliver felt strong. His oxygen flow was stable. His equipment was performing well. At 5:45 a.m., they reached the south summit. The sunrise was underway, painting the Himalayas in shades of gold and rose. Oliver paused to take photographs, images that would later be recovered from his camera and entered into evidence during the lawsuit. In one of those photographs, you can see his face clearly. He's smiling. His eyes are bright with wonder. He looks like a man who has achieved his dream. 45 minutes later, he would be dead. The traverse from the south summit to the Hillary Step is considered one of the most dangerous sections of the climb. The path is narrow. The exposure severe, and the consequences of a fall are catastrophic. Oliver knew this. He had studied this section extensively. He had prepared for exactly this kind of terrain. At approximately 6:30 a.m., as Oliver was navigating the traverse, The binding on his left crampon released. The screw that held it in place sheared through the metallurgical failure that had been building for months, finally manifesting in a fraction of a second. Without the crampon secured, Oliver's left boot lost its purchase on the ice. He began to slip. Dmitri, climbing ahead of Oliver, heard the scream. He turned in time to see Oliver sliding down the icy slope, picking up speed, his body rotating as he tried desperately to self-arrest with his ice axe. The ice axe couldn't bite into the surface at that angle. Oliver continued to slide. 15 meters below the traverse, a rock outcropping jutted from the slope. Oliver struck it head first. The impact was audible from 20 meters away. He came to rest just below the rocks, motionless. Dmitri and Pemba descended to him as quickly as safety allowed. It took them nearly 8 minutes to reach his position. By the time they got there, Oliver was unresponsive. His helmet had cracked from the impact. Blood was pooling beneath his head. Pemba checked for a pulse. There was one, faint, irregular, but present. Oliver was still alive. But they were at 600 meters, in one of the most inaccessible locations on Earth. The nearest medical facility was 3 days of climbing below them. There was no helicopter rescue possible at that altitude. No emergency extraction. No help coming. And Oliver Wright, the man who had spent $400,000 and 5 years preparing for this moment, the man who believed that systems could protect him from any danger, the man whose equipment had just betrayed him, was lying in the snow with a fractured skull, his life measured in minutes. What happened next is the subject of the next chapter. But before we continue, I want you to understand something. Nothing that follows was necessary. None of it had to happen. If one person in a supply chain stretching from Germany to China had done their job honestly, Oliver Wright would have completed his climb, descended safely, called his wife from base camp, and returned home to his children. Instead, he became a victim, and his family became plaintiffs, and an industry became defendants. And everyone, ultimately, became a lesson in what happens when we trust systems we cannot verify. Subscribe now, because this story is only beginning, and the truth gets darker from here. Chapter 3. The Chain of Failure. The crampon binding that killed Oliver Wright contained exactly 17 individual components. 14 of those components were manufactured by Alpine Technical Systems in their facility outside Munich, Germany. 3 of those components, including the pivot screw that failed, were manufactured by Shenzhen Precision Hardware in southern China. This was the supply chain that took a man's life. And understanding how it formed, how it was allowed to persist, and how it remained undetected until it killed someone is essential to understanding what really happened on May 19, 2004. Alpine Technical Systems was founded in 1947 by Heinrich Weber, a German engineer who had spent the war designing precision instruments for the Luftwaffe. After the surrender, Weber redirected his skills to mountaineering equipment, crampons, ice axes, carabiners, and other technical gear. His company built a reputation for meticulous quality control and engineering excellence. For 45 years, ATS manufactured everything in-house. Every component that went into an ATS product was made on ATS machines by ATS employees. The company maintained complete control over its supply chain. This was expensive, but Heinrich Weber believed it was essential. "You cannot guarantee quality you cannot control," he reportedly said. Heinrich Weber died in 1992. His son, Friedrich, took over the company. Friedrich had been educated at business schools rather than engineering programs, and his priorities were different from his father's. He saw ATS as a legacy brand with premium pricing but slim profit margins. He wanted to modernize, which, in his vocabulary, meant reducing costs. The first outsourcing decision came in 1997, when Friedrich contracted with a Taiwanese manufacturer to produce certain plastic components. The move was controversial within the company, but the cost savings were substantial, and the quality remained acceptable. Friedrich saw this as validation. By 2000, he was looking for additional opportunities to reduce manufacturing costs. The binding screws used in crampon assemblies seemed like an obvious candidate. They were simple components, small, standardized, and produced in large quantities. Friedrich believed they could be outsourced without affecting product quality. His engineering team disagreed. They pointed out that binding screws were critical safety components. They experienced extreme stress under climbing conditions. They needed to meet precise metallurgical specifications. The team recommended maintaining in-house production. Friedrich overruled them. The cost differential was too significant to ignore. He directed his procurement department to find an external supplier. The request for proposals went out in late 2000. Several companies responded, including manufacturers in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. The Chinese bid, from Shenzhen Precision Hardware, was by far the lowest, nearly 30% below the next cheapest option. ATS's procurement manager at the time was a man named Klaus Brenner. Klaus had been with the company for 15 years and had serious reservations about the Shenzhen bid. He told Friedrich that prices that low were difficult to achieve without cutting corners on materials or quality control. Friedrich told him to do due diligence and report back. Klaus visited the Shenzhen facility in February 2001. What he found there concerned him. The factory was clean and appeared modern, but the quality control procedures seemed superficial. Workers were producing components quickly without obvious inspection protocols. When Klaus asked to see metallurgical testing equipment, he was shown machines that appeared adequate, but couldn't be demonstrated because they were, quote, undergoing maintenance. Klaus's report to Friedrich recommended against awarding the contract to Shenzhen Precision. He wrote that the company presents significant quality assurance concerns and suggested that the cost savings were not worth the potential risk to product integrity and brand reputation. Friedrich read the report. Then he summoned Klaus to his office and told him to find a way to make the relationship work. The board was demanding improved margins, and this contract would deliver them. Klaus's job, Friedrich said, was to ensure quality, not to second-guess strategic decisions. Klaus returned to Shenzhen in April 2001. This time, he worked with the factory management to develop what he called a, quote, quality assurance protocol. The protocol specified that Shenzhen Precision would submit samples from each production batch to ATS for independent testing. Only batches that passed testing would be accepted. It was a reasonable safeguard, in theory. In practice, it created an enormous loophole. Shenzhen Precision quickly realized that they could produce two different products: high-quality samples for testing and lower-quality goods for actual shipment. As long as the samples passed, no one would know. Wang Jun, the owner of Shenzhen Precision, later admitted in court documents that this substitution began almost immediately. "We would make special units for testing," he said in a translated deposition, "very carefully, with proper materials. Then the regular production would use different materials. Everyone in the factory knew." He was asked why no one reported this obvious fraud. "Report to who?" he replied. "The company wanted cheap parts. We made cheap parts. If they wanted quality, they would pay for quality." The counterfeit screws began flowing into ATS's supply chain in mid-2001. They were incorporated into Crampon assemblies at the Munich facility, where workers had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The parts looked identical to genuine components. The packaging was correct. The documentation was in order. Between July 2001 and May 2004, approximately 48,000 crampons containing Shenzhen Precision screws were sold worldwide. Most of those crampons were used for recreational mountaineering at moderate altitudes, where the defective screws were never stressed to failure. The failure rate under normal conditions was estimated at less than 1%, low enough to avoid detection through customer complaints or warranty returns. But at extreme altitudes under extreme conditions, the failure rate was much higher. Later investigation would identify at least 3 other incidents prior to Oliver Wright's death, where ATS crampons had experienced binding failures in high-altitude environments. 2 of those incidents resulted in injuries. One resulted in a death: a Japanese climber named Kenji Tanaka, who fell on Cho Oyu in September 2003. Tanaka's death was attributed to user error at the time. No investigation was conducted into equipment failure. His body was never recovered, and his crampons were never examined. It would be years before his family learned that his death may have been caused by the same defect that killed Oliver Wright. If you're outraged right now, you should be. This wasn't an accident. This was a predictable consequence of decisions made for profit. Subscribe to this channel because we hold these companies accountable. We expose these stories, and we make sure the victims aren't forgotten. Oliver Wright purchased his ATS Extreme 9000 crampons from a shop called Venture Outdoors in Islington, London, on January 14, 2003. The receipt, entered into evidence during the lawsuit, shows the purchase price, £11,950. He tested the crampons extensively before his expedition. He used them on training climbs in the Alps and Scotland. He inspected them before every use and after every climb. He followed all manufacturer recommendations for maintenance and care. The crampons performed perfectly during this testing phase. The bindings held. The screws remained secure. Oliver recorded in his equipment log that the ATS crampons were the best I've ever used. Solid, reliable, confidence-inspiring. He had no way of knowing that the screws in his particular set were from a batch manufactured in Shenzhen in October 2002. He had no way of knowing that those screws had never been tested to specification. He had no way of knowing that they were slowly degrading every time he used them, each stress cycle propagating the microscopic fractures that would eventually cause failure. The expedition to Everest began on April 12, 2004. Oliver's crampons were packed in his personal gear bag, carefully protected from damage during transport. He performed an inspection at base camp on April 29, the day after arrival. Everything looked fine. Over the following 3 weeks, as the team conducted acclimatization rotations, Oliver used his crampons repeatedly on the fixed ropes through the Khumbu icefall and up the Lhotse face. Each use added stress to the defective screws. Each temperature cycle, the warming of day, the freezing of night, accelerated the degradation process. By mid-May, the pivot screw in Oliver's left crampon was operating on borrowed time. The internal structure had been compromised. The metal was ready to fail. All it needed was one more stress event, one more sharp impact, one more sudden load, to trigger catastrophic failure. That event came at 6:30 a.m. on May 19, 2004, when Oliver's boot struck an ice formation on the traverse below the Hillary Step. The impact was minor, the kind of thing that happens dozens of times during any Everest summit push. Under normal circumstances, it would have been inconsequential. But the screw was not normal, and when the impact came, the screw sheared through. The failure was instantaneous and complete. One moment the crampon binding was secure. The next moment it was loose, the metal separated, the mechanism inoperable. Oliver's left boot lost all traction. On a 50-degree ice slope at 600 meters, that loss was fatal. He tried to arrest his fall. Dmitry Volkov described the attempt in his incident report. Oliver immediately deployed his ice axe in self-arrest position. He was doing everything correctly, but the slope was very hard ice and he was gaining speed quickly. The axe could not bite. The slide lasted approximately 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, Oliver traveled 15 meters down the slope, his body accelerating despite his attempts to stop. The rock outcropping materialized below him, a dark mass emerging from the white ice, and he struck it at an estimated speed of 35 kilometers per hour. The impact fractured his skull in 3 places. His helmet, which was rated to withstand exactly this kind of trauma, cracked under the force. The protective foam inside compressed beyond its design limits. Oliver's brain, cushioned by less than optimal protection, collided with the inside of his skull. He lost consciousness immediately. He never regained it. The aftermath on the mountain was chaos. Dmitry and Pemba reached Oliver within 8 minutes of his fall. What they found was a climber in critical condition at an altitude where critical conditions were effectively death sentences. Dmitry's training kicked in. He checked Oliver's airway. Clear. He checked breathing. Present but shallow. He checked circulation. Pulse weak and irregular. The classic ABC assessment told him that Oliver was alive, but fading. Pemba used the expedition radio to contact base camp. "We have a serious accident," he reported. "Right Sahib has fallen. Head injury. He is not conscious. We need guidance." The response from base camp was immediate but hopeless. Dr. Sarah Chen, the expedition physician stationed at lower altitude, walked Pemba through emergency assessment procedures. She asked about pupil response, unequal, with one pupil significantly larger than the other. She asked about bleeding, significant, from both the visible wound and probable internal hemorrhage. She asked about responsiveness, none. "You need to get him lower," Dr. Chen said. "As fast as possible. But I have to be honest with you. At that altitude, with those injuries, the prognosis is very poor." Moving an unconscious climber down from 8,600 meters is one of the most difficult operations in mountaineering. Under optimal conditions, with a full rescue team and proper equipment, it takes hours. Under the conditions facing Dimitri and Pemba, 2 climbers, limited resources, extreme altitude, and a patient who couldn't assist in any way, it was nearly impossible. They tried anyway. They secured Oliver to a makeshift sled constructed from sleeping pads and webbing. They began the descent, taking turns controlling the sled while the other managed the fixed ropes. The effort lasted 45 minutes. In that time, they covered approximately 200 vertical meters, a fraction of the distance they needed to travel. Oliver's condition deteriorated throughout. His breathing became more labored. His pulse became harder to detect. At approximately 7:45 a.m., Pemba checked for vital signs and found none. Oliver Wright was dead. The official time of death was recorded as 7:43 a.m. local time, May 19, 2004. The official cause was traumatic brain injury resulting from a fall. The official classification was accidental death. But there was nothing accidental about it. There was a chain of causation that stretched from that icy slope all the way back to a factory in China, a boardroom in Germany, and a set of decisions made for money by people who never thought about the human consequences. Oliver Wright's body was secured to the slope at 8,400 meters, where Dimitri and Pemba had no choice but to leave it. Recovering a body from that altitude is extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Most bodies on Everest remain where they fall. Catherine Wright received the news at 6:15 a.m. London time. She was awakened by a phone call from the expedition's logistics coordinator in Kathmandu. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. She remembered the exact words. "Mrs. Wright, I'm very sorry to inform you that there has been an accident. Your husband fell this morning while descending from the summit. He did not survive." She asked what happened. The coordinator said he didn't have details yet, but promised more information soon. She asked about his body. The coordinator said it was on the mountain and would likely need to remain there. She asked how she was supposed to tell her children. The coordinator had no answer for that. Thomas was 12, Eleanor was 10, and James was 8 when they learned their father was never coming home. Catherine gathered them in the living room that morning and told them as gently as she could that there had been an accident, that their father had been hurt very badly, and that he had died. The children's reactions were described in Catherine's lawsuit filing. Thomas, the oldest, went silent and remained that way for days. Eleanor cried immediately and didn't stop for hours. James asked if his father would be brought home so they could say goodbye. That was the hardest part, Catherine testified, explaining to an 8-year-old that his father's body was frozen on a mountain on the other side of the world, and that we would probably never be able to bring him back. In the weeks that followed, as Catherine began the process of settling Oliver's affairs, questions emerged about what had caused the fall. The official account attributed it to a slip on icy terrain. Tragic, but not unusual. Everest killed experienced climbers regularly. But Catherine knew her husband. She knew his preparation, his equipment, his attention to detail. She couldn't accept that he had simply slipped. She requested the return of Oliver's gear from the expedition. Most of it was recovered and shipped to London in June 2004. Among the items, his crampons. The left crampon was clearly damaged. The binding mechanism had released, and the pivot screw was missing, sheared off at the point of failure. Catherine photographed the crampon and set it aside, not yet understanding what she was looking at. It would take another 18 months before she understood. And when she did, she would dedicate the rest of her life to seeking justice. If you're invested in this story, if you want to see justice delivered, then subscribe now. Share this video. Leave a comment. The more visibility these stories get, the harder it becomes for corporations to bury their failures. And there's much more to reveal. Chapter 4. The Descent into Darkness. The summit push that killed Oliver Wright had begun with such promise. The weather window was perfect. The team was strong. Every indicator suggested success. And for the first 7 hours, those indicators proved accurate. Dmitry Volkov, the expedition leader, would later describe those hours as among the finest climbing of his career. The conditions were exceptional, he said in his incident report. Clear skies, light winds, stable temperatures. We were moving well. Everyone was in good spirits. Oliver especially. He seemed to be enjoying every moment. The team had left Camp 4 at 10:15 p.m. on May 18th. The plan was straightforward. Climb through the night, reach the summit around sunrise, descend immediately, and return to Camp 4 by early afternoon. It was a standard timeline, executed by thousands of climbers before them. The first waypoint was the balcony, at 400 meters. They arrived at 3:30 a.m., slightly ahead of schedule. The team took a brief rest, checked equipment, and hydrated. Oliver noted in his voice recorder, which was recovered from his body, that he felt strong, focused, ready. The recording captured the moment. We're at the balcony, about 4 hours from the summit. Everything looks perfect. The stars are unbelievable. I've never seen them this clear. I'm thinking about Catherine and the kids. I'll call them from the top. This is going to be a good day. It's difficult to listen to that recording now, knowing what came next. The confidence in his voice, the anticipation, the love for his family, all of it preserved in digital format, a snapshot of a man who had less than 4 hours to live. From the balcony, the route ascends toward the south summit. The climbing becomes more technical, with exposed ridges and steep ice faces. Oliver was experienced in this terrain. He had trained specifically for it, and he moved with confidence. At 5:45 a.m., the team reached the south summit. The sun was rising over the Tibetan Plateau, illuminating the highest peaks on Earth in shades of gold and rose. Oliver paused to take photographs, several of which were recovered from his camera. In one image, he's standing on the south summit with his arms raised, the main summit of Everest visible behind him. His face is partially obscured by his oxygen mask, but his eyes are visible, and they're filled with joy. He was less than an hour from achieving his life's goal. He made another voice recording at the south summit. This is it, the final push. I can see the Hillary Step from here, maybe 45 minutes to the top. The sunrise. I can't even describe it. This was worth everything. All the training, all the preparation, all the sacrifice. This moment, right here, makes it all worthwhile. A pause. Then, I love you, Catherine. I love you, Thomas, Eleanor, James. I'll see you all soon. Those were the last words Oliver Wright ever recorded. The traverse from the south summit to the Hillary Step is approximately 300 meters of the most exposed terrain on Everest. The path is narrow, in some places barely wide enough for one person, and the drops on either side are measured in thousands of feet. Climbers move slowly here, carefully, with absolute attention to every footstep. Oliver was third in line, behind Dimitri and Pemba. The spacing between climbers was approximately 10 meters, standard for this section, providing enough room for each person to move independently while maintaining visual contact. At approximately 6:28 a.m., according to Dimitri's timeline, Oliver's left crampon struck a small ice formation on the slope. The impact was minor, the kind of contact that happens constantly during alpine climbing. Under normal circumstances, it would have been unremarkable, but the pivot screw in Oliver's crampon binding had been weakening for months. The counterfeit metal, stressed by thousands of loading cycles in extreme conditions, had developed internal fractures that were invisible to the naked eye. The impact at 6:28 a.m. was the final stress the screw could absorb. It sheared through at 6:29 a.m. The failure was silent. Dimitri heard nothing until Oliver's first exclamation of surprise. He said something like, "What?" or, "Wait," Dimitri recalled. I turned around just in time to see his left boot slip. His crampon was loose, hanging off his boot at a strange angle. He immediately tried to stabilize, but he was already off balance. On a 50-degree ice slope, losing one crampon is catastrophic. The remaining crampon doesn't provide enough stability to maintain position. The boot without the crampon has no purchase at all. The climber begins to slide almost immediately. Oliver slid. He went into self-arrest position. Ice axe braked against the slope. Body rotated to spread weight and increase friction, exactly as he had been trained. But the ice was too hard, the angle too steep, the speed building too quickly. Dimitri watched helplessly as his client and friend accelerated down the slope. There was nothing I could do, he said later. He was doing everything right. The technique was perfect. But the conditions, the ice was like glass. His axe couldn't bite. Pemba, who was ahead of Dimitri, heard the commotion and turned. He saw Oliver sliding toward the rock outcropping below. I shouted for him to dig in, Pemba recalled. I don't know if he heard me. He was moving so fast. The rock outcropping that Oliver struck was a permanent feature of the traverse, a dark protrusion of granite that had been exposed by decades of wind and ice erosion. It sat approximately 15 meters below the standard climbing route, directly in the fall line from Oliver's position. The impact was violent. Oliver's head struck the rock first, despite his attempts to rotate his body. The force of the collision fractured his helmet, cracked his skull, and caused immediate traumatic brain injury. He came to rest just below the rock, his body sprawled across the ice at an unnatural angle. He was not moving. Dimitri and Pemba began their descent immediately. Safety protocols dictated that they should not unclip from the fixed rope, that they should maintain 3 points of contact at all times, that they should move carefully even in an emergency. They followed these protocols, but they moved as fast as safety allowed. It took them 8 minutes to reach Oliver. In mountaineering, 8 minutes can mean the difference between life and death. In this case, it probably didn't matter. The severity of Oliver's injuries was beyond what field treatment could address. When they reached him, Oliver was unconscious but breathing. His helmet was cracked, blood was seeping from beneath it, and his eyes were unfocused and unresponsive. Pemba checked his pupil response. One pupil was significantly larger than the other, a classic sign of traumatic brain injury. We knew it was bad, Dimitri said. At sea level, with a hospital nearby, he might have had a chance. But at 600 meters hours from any medical facility, we knew. They tried anyway. That's what climbers do. They refuse to accept the inevitable until the inevitable becomes undeniable. The radio call to base camp established the parameters of the situation. Dr. Sarah Chen, monitoring from lower altitude, walked them through emergency procedures. Stabilize the head and neck. Control bleeding if possible. Maintain airway. Keep him as warm as possible. And get him lower, she said, as fast as you can. Every meter of altitude you lose improves his chances. They built a makeshift sled from sleeping pads and webbing. They secured Oliver to it as gently as possible. They began the impossible descent. 2 exhausted climbers at extreme altitude, trying to move an unconscious man down one of the most dangerous mountains on Earth. For 45 minutes, they fought gravity, altitude, and exhaustion. They lost 200 vertical meters, less than a quarter of the distance to Camp 4. Oliver's condition deteriorated throughout. His breathing became increasingly labored. His skin took on a grayish pallor. At 7:43 a.m., Pemba checked for a pulse and found none. He checked again, pressing harder, willing the heartbeat to return. Nothing. He's gone, he said to Dimitri. The words seemed to hang in the thin air, inadequate to the magnitude of what had happened. They sat with Oliver's body for several minutes. Dimitri said something, a prayer, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement of a life that had ended. Pemba arranged Oliver's hands across his chest. Then, because they had no choice, they secured the body to the slope and continued their descent. They couldn't carry him any farther. They were at the limits of their own endurance. Staying longer risked becoming victims themselves. Oliver Wright remained on Everest, his body frozen at 400 meters, a permanent fixture of the mountain that had killed him. If you've made it this far in the video, you're clearly invested in understanding what really happened. That's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is for. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. We're only halfway through the truth. The news reached base camp at 8:17 a.m. The logistics team immediately began coordinating with other expeditions and with authorities in Kathmandu. The expedition's satellite phone rang continuously. Media organizations, family contacts, insurance companies, all wanting information. The first priority was notifying Catherine. The logistics coordinator, a man named James Morrison, made the call at 6:15 a.m. London time. He had made similar calls before. Death on Everest was not uncommon, but he later said this one was different. Most climbers who die on Everest, there's an element of, I don't know how to say this, there's an element of, they knew the risks, Morrison said. But Oliver wasn't like that. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't unprepared. He was one of the most careful climbers I ever worked with. It didn't make sense. Catherine received the call in her bedroom. She had been sleeping poorly since Oliver's departure. The anxiety of waiting was constant, and the ring of the phone at that hour told her everything before Morrison spoke. The conversation was brief. Morrison delivered the essential facts: accident on the descent, head injury, attempts at rescue, death confirmed at 7:43 a.m. Nepal time. Catherine asked questions. What exactly happened? Where is his body? Is there any chance it was a mistake? And Morrison answered as best he could. She asked when Oliver would be brought home. Morrison explained that recovering bodies from extreme altitude was often impossible. Catherine went silent for a long moment. I think she was processing, Morrison recalled. Not just the death, but the permanence of it. That she would never see him again, never bury him, never have a grave to visit. That's a different kind of loss. Catherine ended the call and went to wake her children. The media coverage began within hours. Everest deaths always attracted attention, and Oliver's profile, wealthy hedge fund manager, extensive preparation, summit attempt, made for compelling copy. News organizations ran stories with headlines like "City Tycoon Dies on Everest Dream" and "Millionaire's Tragic Mountain Quest." The coverage focused on Oliver's wealth and ambition. Some of it was sympathetic. Some of it carried an undertone of schadenfreude, another rich man who thought he could buy his way to the top of the world and paid the ultimate price. Catherine hated the coverage. It reduced Oliver to a stereotype and ignored everything that made him exceptional. It didn't mention his years of training, his careful preparation, his genuine love for mountaineering. It certainly didn't mention that his equipment had failed. In the weeks following Oliver's death, Catherine began gathering information. She requested detailed incident reports from Dmitri and the other team members. She obtained copies of Oliver's expedition logs and voice recordings. She arranged for the return of his equipment. When the gear arrived in London, she examined it carefully. Most items were unremarkable, damaged by the fall, but otherwise normal. But the left crampon caught her attention. The binding mechanism was clearly compromised. The pivot screw was missing, sheared off at the base. The failure point was smooth, indicating a clean break rather than gradual wear. Catherine photographed everything. She didn't know yet what she was looking at, but her legal training told her to document everything. She reached out to metallurgical experts. She contacted Alpine Technical Systems. She began asking questions that no one seemed eager to answer. The company's initial response was bureaucratic and unhelpful. They expressed condolences. They pointed out that mountaineering was inherently dangerous. They suggested that the equipment had been subjected to conditions beyond its design parameters. Catherine wasn't satisfied. Something about the failure didn't make sense. Oliver had used ATS crampons before without issue. The failure had been sudden and complete, not gradual. And the missing screw, where had it gone? Why had it failed? She hired an independent engineering firm to analyze the remaining crampon components. The analysis took 3 months and cost £40,000. But when the results came back, Catherine had her answer. The metallurgical composition of the remaining screws, there were 3 others in the binding mechanism, did not match ATS specifications. The steel alloy was inferior, with lower tensile strength and higher susceptibility to stress fracturing. The screws were, in the engineering firm's conclusion, unsuitable for high-stress applications and inconsistent with manufacturer specifications. In other words, counterfeit. Catherine now understood what had killed her husband. Not the mountain, not an accident. A fraud, perpetrated somewhere in the supply chain between ATS's factory and her husband's crampon. She filed her first lawsuit in December 2005, naming Alpine Technical Systems as the defendant. The case would expand over the following years to include Shenzhen Precision Hardware, various distributors, and individual executives who had known or should have known about the quality control failures. 20 years later, that lawsuit is still ongoing, but the evidence that's emerged has exposed a pattern of corporate negligence that extends far beyond one climber's death. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, we're going to reveal exactly what the investigation uncovered and who tried to bury it. Chapter 5. The 15-meter fall. The physics of Oliver Wright's death can be calculated with cold precision. From the moment his crampon released to the moment he struck the rock, approximately 2 seconds elapsed. He traveled 15. 3 meters vertically and 7 meters horizontally. His terminal velocity at impact was approximately 35 kilometers per hour, not fast in absolute terms, but devastating when the stopping mechanism is a granite outcropping and the point of contact is a human skull. The fall trajectory has been reconstructed multiple times by the expedition's insurance investigators, by Catherine's legal team, by independent mountaineering consultants. All the reconstructions reached the same conclusion. Given the equipment failure, the outcome was inevitable. No amount of skill or preparation could have prevented the fatal impact. This is what haunts Catherine Wright to this day. Her husband did everything right. His technique was perfect. His preparation was exhaustive. He didn't make any mistakes. And he died anyway, because someone else, somewhere far from that mountain, had made a decision that prioritized profit over human life. The moment of failure was so brief that Oliver probably didn't fully understand what was happening until it was too late. One instant he was moving confidently across the traverse, focused on the path ahead, anticipating the summit that was less than an hour away. The next instant, his left boot was skidding on ice, his weight was shifting catastrophically, and gravity was taking over. Dmitry Volkov's account of those final seconds is the most detailed available. He was approximately 10 meters ahead of Oliver on the fixed rope, and he turned at the first sound of disturbance. Oliver made a sound, not a scream, more like a surprised exclamation. Dmitry recalled, "I turned and saw him off balance, his left foot sliding. His crampon was loose, hanging at an angle that made no sense. He was already starting to slide when I saw him." The next image Dmitry described was Oliver deploying his ice axe. "Textbook self-arrest," Dmitry said. He rotated his body, pressed the pick into the ice, tried to create friction. It's exactly what you're trained to do. But the ice was too hard. We were on wind-polished blue ice, almost like glass. The axe couldn't penetrate. The slide accelerated. Oliver's body rotated despite his efforts to control it. The gradient of the slope, approximately 50 degrees at that point, was steep enough to make any arrest extremely difficult, even under optimal conditions. With only one crampon functional and hard ice beneath him, Oliver had almost no chance. "I watched him slide," Dmitry said. "There was nothing I could do. I couldn't reach him. I couldn't throw him a rope. I could only watch." The rock outcropping appeared in Oliver's path like a dark inevitability. He saw it coming. Dmitry observed him trying to alter his trajectory in the final seconds, but physics was immutable. He struck the rock head first at 6:29 a.m. on May 19, 2004. The impact dynamics were analyzed as part of the lawsuit. A biomechanical expert reconstructed the collision based on the damage to Oliver's helmet, the location of his injuries, and the characteristics of the rock surface. Oliver's skull sustained 3 separate fractures, one to the left temporal region, one to the right parietal region, and one to the occipital region at the base of the skull. The fracture pattern indicated a rotational impact. His head struck the rock at an angle, then continued to rotate, striking additional points. The occipital fracture was the fatal one. It damaged the brainstem, causing immediate loss of consciousness and progressive respiratory failure. Even with immediate access to a trauma center, survival would have been unlikely. At 600 meters on Everest, survival was impossible. Oliver's helmet, an ATS Summit Pro rated for exactly this kind of impact, did provide some protection. The biomechanical analysis estimated that without the helmet, Oliver would have died instantly. With it, he survived the impact, but succumbed to injuries within approximately 70 minutes. This marginal difference, living for 70 minutes rather than dying immediately, mattered enormously to Catherine when she learned about it. Her husband had been alive when Dmitry and Pemba reached him. He had been alive during the agonizing descent attempt. He had been alive when they stopped to rest, when they radioed base camp, when they discussed their options. He was still there, Catherine said in her testimony. Somewhere inside that broken body, my husband was still there. He was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to save him, but he was still there. I think about that constantly. I think about whether he knew, whether he was afraid, whether he was thinking about us. The 45 minutes between reaching Oliver and confirming his death were among the most difficult of Dmitry Volkov's life. He had lost clients before. Mountaineering guides accept that as a possibility, but never like this. Oliver was special, Dmitry said. Most clients, they rely on you. They follow your lead. Oliver was different. He was a partner. He understood the mountain. He made good decisions. He didn't need to be managed. The descent attempt was futile from the beginning, but Dmitri refused to acknowledge that. "You have to try," he said. "You can't."